Pablo, there we go, we're being recorded. Pablo Gershanik and Clark Baim. And we'll be talking, we're winding up the second season of Unrehearsed Futures, and we are talking about trauma and drama, applications of theater to psychotherapy and to the benefit of the community, to individuals and to the community. So it's really a kind of discussion of applied theater. My friends, Clark and Pablo, are artists and also therapists, and they have innovated substantially with method. And so they're going to tell you about their innovations. And I'm going to also depart from Unrehearsed Futures protocol by talking a bit about myself, because I also I'm a trained psychotherapist, and I've innovated with the methods of Gestalt. So I'm going to speak a bit about what I do with psychotherapy at the moment. But first, I would like to introduce my interlocutors and ask them to introduce themselves. At the same time, they're going to answer two initial questions. They're going to address what their innovation and their methods are, and they're going to say what the use and purpose of their methods are. And they're going to also address this interesting question, which is, what does it mean to reconstruct a life through theater? So I'm going to hand it over first to you, Clark. If you could tell us, you're in Birmingham, correct?
I'm in Birmingham, England, although I come originally from Chicago in the United States. Thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this. My own background originally was I was working in applied theater in prisons across the United States, and then I did that for 10 years in British prisons also, using theater as a method of working with prisoners and with the staff in the prisons, trying to use it to create a more rehabilitative environment in prisons. I moved on to study psychodrama, and so I work now as a psychodramatist and a trainer, and I also continue to teach applied theater students. The model that I've created, I call drama spiral, and I'm going to show that. And it was a part of a PhD that I finished a few years ago, and a book that I wrote, which I'll show an image of in a minute, called Staging the Personal, which is essentially, it's about how we work in a safe way and ethically with people who want to share their stories on the stage. And particularly in my work in prisons and then as a psychodrama psychotherapist, using elements of drama in therapeutic processes, I became very aware of issues around safety and ethics and boundaries in how you help people to stage their stories. I went out in the field and I watched lots of productions that do this sort of work, and I became aware of very good practice and also some very risky practice where I thought people might be very fragile and sharing stories in ways that made them very vulnerable and left them in a very vulnerable state. So I developed this model that I'll show you now based on that work. So the book is called Staging the Personal, and I go into the history of this type of work. I have a chapter on ethics. I introduce the drama spiral, and then I talk about the intentions of working with people's personal stories, and I offer a lesson plan on how to teach the drama spiral at the end. This PowerPoint will be made available to people who attend today. So what's the issue at stake? Contemporary theater has crossed boldly into therapeutic terrain and is now the site of radical self-exposure. This is just one example of a theater production where a married couple were sharing on the stage very personal issues to do with his clinical depression and the effects on him and their marriage. Highly personal. I would also note that that production gained a huge amount of notoriety. And when I saw it, it was no holds barred, very public airing of extremely private material. I did some tracking back into the history of this. And noted that since the 1970s and accelerating since about 2000, there's been a rapid expansion in the use of people's personal stories in the theater, in both applied and commercial theater contexts. And in particular, there was a theater company called It's All Right to Be Woman back in the early to mid 1970s in the eastern part of the United States. That's one of the first companies that I could find where they were specifically mining their own lives and very tricky, dangerous material from their own lives and putting it onto the stage for audiences. And so now, given the highly personal nature of much of the material that's being used in such processes, my take on this is that it's imperative that theater practitioners interrogate the ethics of this work and develop models of practice that maintain sound ethics, stay within appropriate boundaries, and avoid exploiting and harming participants, performers, and audiences. And so this is the drama spiral. On the left is the spiral itself. On the right is a sort of a key that explains each of the 6 rings of the spiral. And I'll just say here at the outer ring here of games and exercises, games and creative activities, this would include all of the things that we tend to do at the start of theater processes: group building, warm-ups, theater games, communication and performance skills, also dance, music, song, etc. And there will be many contexts in which I still work, whether that's in a prison or a day activity center, a psychiatric hospital, where I just stay at this level. I know I never go any further than that. However, in some situations, we might stage stories with them. And here we might be at the level of fictional or distant stories, myths, fables, scripted drama that's already a part of the literary canon. And so these are fictional stories, or they could be true stories, but distant from the people in the group, not from their own lives. At the level 3 here, we're dealing with fictionalized personal stories. So with fictionalized personal stories, the people on stage in the drama might know that certain aspects of their own personal stories are being used, but it's been put through a fictional process. So it's not so personal when they're presenting it to audiences. Metaphor, drama therapy very typically works at this level. Use of metaphor to create a container around the work is a very important aspect of this. At the level of positive personal stories, people will be sharing personal stories, and when they present it to audiences, they are explicitly noting, this is my story. But it's about non-problematic territory. It's about stories of strength, of success, maybe stories of celebration. And this gets into this idea of why would people want to share stories? Well, it might be to celebrate an aspect of life, to share an experience, to find meaning in an experience. Then at level 5, we might be sharing stories of resolved difficulties. So this is something that perhaps earlier in my life was very traumatic and difficult for me, maybe destabilizing for me. But now I've mostly resolved it. And it's now become a story, perhaps even a story of my strength, my triumph over adversity. And now maybe I want to share that story with others so they don't suffer as I did, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel in how to deal with this. And this is the whole area of post-traumatic growth, the idea that we can actually be stronger, where in the past we may have been broken. And then here at ring 6 of the spiral, these are stories of unresolved difficulties, things that are still triggering for us. The recollection of this story might become very destabilizing for us. And in general, we need to have a lot of safety measures in place to make sure that people are properly cared for, because people who have unresolved trauma may inadvertently re-traumatize themselves or restage a trauma that they are unaware of. And so we have to have some extra skills, some extra abilities, and also some extra safeties in place. Now, as a psychodramatist, this is the area that I very typically work with people who are in psychotherapy. However, it's very important to note that I have also seen certain theater companies working with participants to share stories about very difficult and painful material that is still ongoing in their life. And in all cases where I've seen good practice around that, the theater practitioners themselves have had extra training, they have extra levels of supervision, and also in all cases, those are long-term projects. They're not just mining this material, staging it, and moving on. They're working with those groups of people over significant periods of time. So I'll come out of the screen share there. That was just a very quick 10-minute introduction. And I think that after we hear from Pablo and Amy, perhaps we can revisit some of the drama spiral. But I wanted to explain why I created the drama spiral and what the distinctions were between those 6 rings of working. Is that okay for now, Amy?
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So, and Clark is really a highly qualified drama therapist. So you're.
I'll just offer a little correction there.
Yes.
It's a bit technical, but there is a distinction between psychodrama and drama therapy. There's a crossover. Yeah. And the words themselves can be confusing, but it's different bodies of training. But there are interesting distinctions also. But the general principle, you're right. It's a therapeutic use of drama techniques.
It'll be very interesting to hear you maybe tell us a bit more about that distinction. Pablo and I are began probably working first and foremost as artist practitioners. So over to you, Pablo. Can you tell us about your innovation with theater and therapy?
Well, thank you very much, Amy, for this invitation, and Clark for this inspiring initially conversation. I identify fully with what you are creating with the spiral. I come from theater, and I come from a family where health is the most important topic for generations of doctors and psychoanalysts. So even if I do theater, I think that there's something in my lineage that has to do with health. I was trained first in a conservatory in Mexico as a traditional speech actor, and then I decided that I wanted to go towards the body, that there was something about my intellectual training and my intellectual family that needed to have this space of the body. And by going there, I decided to go to Paris to train at the École Internationale de Théâtre Jacques Lecoq. And then through that, I started clowning, and I met different object theaters and puppet theater companies. And so that's what created somehow the melting pot of what I do. Circus in a way, theater, physical theater, masks, and puppeteers and puppetry at the same time. And I come from a country and a generation and a continent that suffered a lot of violence during the 70s, specifically traumatic experiences personally and socially. And I come from a family that suffered a lot with that. And working with that lack, working with that wound, I decided some years ago that I wanted to work on this idea of what does it mean for a person, for a family, for a community to reconstruct a tragedy, to reconstruct a tragic event. If reconstructing means, in a way, to be able to do as a kind of intimate archaeologist, to get back to the ground zero of what we have lived, personally or socially speaking, or if the idea of reconstruction means to reconstruct ourselves, to retell the story in a different way, in a metaphoric way. So based on that experience, I create what I call today the Intimate Models Lab. And it's based on a piece that I created in a space that was an emblematic space of the horror in Argentina, where I was born, which is the most important concentration camp of the Americas during the 70s. So I was invited to go there and to spend a couple of months there creating an artistic response to that residency. And this, what you're going to see now in this video is a response or the answer that I found to that. So thank you very much, Falguni. If you can share with the community the video, please. Thanks a lot.
Aucune histoire n'est personnelle. Toute histoire est sociale. Toute histoire est culturelle. Toute histoire est collective. Parce que c'est là que la rencontre entre la petite histoire, l'histoire personnelle et l'histoire collective s'est faite. Et c'est ce qu'on va faire pendant cette semaine. Un laboratoire autour de qu'est-ce que ça veut dire de reconstruire un événement tragique, un événement traumatique, un événement emblématique et le détourner. Et trouver certaines ressources théâtrales, des mémoires, des liens sociaux pour, dans un petit dispositif, explorer, s'exprimer et laisser venir quelque chose. Ça va? Ça, je monologue. Là, j'écoute pas. Là, je travaille pour moi. Mais là, je travaille à l'écoute. Donc, je me permets de proposer quelque chose et de voir s'il me suit. Pour cette idée de représentation, les objets seront nos grands complices. Dans cette idée de la métaphore, dans cette idée de détournement, que parfois même pas le corps de l'interprète peut faire. Eh ben voilà, et toi tu le suis, mais parce que c'est lui qui est en train de bouger, c'est pas toi. Fais-lui bouger, voilà. Ah voilà, donne-toi le temps pour respirer avec elle. Voilà. Et on connaît très bien ces personnages. On l'a tous vécu, ces personnages-là.
Maman, raconte-moi comment c'était mon père, comment c'était la guerre en Espagne et en Algérie.
Enfin, pose une question et donne du temps. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire il est où papa? Dis-moi, il est où papa? Maman? Maman? Je te parle, maman. Donne un bébé, pas un pull. Donne un bébé. Voilà. Ah, voilà. Ces gestes, voilà. Ces simples gestes fait un bébé. Ça fait un pull. Ça fait un bébé. Ah.
Qu'est-ce que c'est de reconstruire une tragédie? Qu'est-ce que ça implique pour une personne, pour une famille, pour une société de réagir à un événement traumatique? Reconstruire implique documenter ou raconter et se raconter l'histoire d'une nouvelle façon. Mon père, Mario, médecin pédiatre, militant politique et joueur de rugby, a été assassiné dans cette ville, la ville de La Plata. 40 ans après, je me suis donné à la tâche de reconstruire dans une maquette les jours de notre tragédie et les histoires personnelles et collectives autour. Je me suis interrogé sur si une maquette pouvait aider d'autres à élaborer leur histoire de la même façon que m'avait aidé moi. C'est là que j'ai créé avec une équipe de collaborateurs maquettes intimes. On invite au laboratoire à des gens qui ont vécu une expérience traumatique à maquettiser de façon résiliente leur histoire. Avec des outils de l'art et de la psychologie, les participants trouvent une nouvelle façon d'approcher des expériences personnelles et collectives.
Donc il est 19h38 quand nos regards se trouvent pour la première fois. J'ai jamais vu autant d'intensité, un bleu profond. J'ai jamais vu autant de beauté. J'ai entendu les docteurs qui t'ont sorti s'exclamer, il est tout carré. Je leur ai répondu, c'est un bébé Picasso. Et moi, j'aimerais bien construire une sorte d'énorme sein rose, très très pop. Moi, j'étais au Bataclan. J'étais avec des amis.
Un village qui est dans les Pyrénées orientales, dans la montagne.
Et puis ils nous disent, est-ce que c'est Charlie? Est-ce que c'est Charlie? Puis ils s'énervent.
L'histoire est désespérée et la fin est extrêmement triste.
Je vais parler du retour au Congo.
La seule chose que je me souviens le plus, c'est les yeux de Chérif Kouachi. On voyait que les yeux.
Qu'est-ce qu'on voyait?
Les yeux.
Qu'est-ce qu'on voyait?
Les yeux.
C'était quoi comme yeux?
D'un gamin, quand j'ai discuté avec lui.
Un gamin?
C'est un gamin manipulé, même pas méchant.
Je voulais me dire que j'ai réussi à sortir de là-dedans. C'est un miracle et du coup c'est pour ça que j'ai voulu le faire ouvert parce que c'est la bonne étoile qui m'a protégée.
Offre-toi cette possibilité de faire d'une image devant laquelle tu as envie de partir en courant, une image avec laquelle au moins, tu es capable de te ficher la paix, au moins. Parce qu'elle, elle va être toujours avec toi.
Je suis toujours sous la table, je suis toujours sous la table.
Tu vois? Donc comment tu sors de sous la table et tu vas sur la table. Et ça, c'est d'aller sur la table.
Je n'entendais que le mot Charlie de la bouche masquée de ces hommes. Charlie, Charlie, Charlie. Je ne voyais que des yeux paniqués, sur une peau livide, entourée de noir. Vous êtes trompé de société. Je ne suis pas Charlie.
Paris has this strong power to make you fall in love over and over again. The place that makes you want to dance under the stars.
Je m'appelle Antonin. Je vais vous raconter l'histoire de mon clan. J'ai perdu ma maman à l'âge de 11 ans.
Et donc docteurs me prennent peut-être pour une folle qui délire, mais moi je veux t'accueillir, te rassurer, te souhaiter la bienvenue dans ce monde.
Triste seul au soleil couchant.
Well, thanks a lot
Thank
for
you.
sharing this time. So, well, ready to listen to you, Amy, and to start this conversation with all of you.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for these two very, very beautiful presentations. And that was very moving. And I think in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll just turn to our final question to both of you, and then I will speak also sort of bundling all the questions that we had together, because I think the images are still fresh in people's minds. So Pablo, I just would like to ask you first, given that most of the people probably in the room are artists, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind as an artist as you make the transition into working therapeutically? And that touches a little bit on our last question, which is some of the pitfalls and the dangers that might accompany that step from art into therapy.
I always remember that the most fantastic moment for me of the day was when my mother was sitting with me in my bed to tell me a story to go and dream. And I will always trust and rely on the healing power of fiction. I think the possibility of creating metaphors, the possibility of transforming an event, a painful event, an invisible wound, into a metaphorical way of expression allows us not just to transform the way we talk and the way we live and experience, but the way we share that with a community, which is the other important thing for me, the sense of community. Once we have a drama is not personal, a drama is a social drama necessarily. And that's what melodrama teaches us, the big story between the little one. So for me, this capacity of what can we do with that? The point is not what happened to us, but what do we do with that? And there is where fiction and metaphor transforms and has this important capacity of giving us clues to project in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. That's great. And Clark, what would you say to that? I mean, what if you also transitioned from working with drama into full-fledged psychodrama? What would you say is important to bear in mind as you make that transition, and what are some of the pitfalls and dangers?
Well, one of the big issues is who is it going to be presented to? So I noticed in the video we just watched, it was being presented to people who had been involved in the workshop, Pablo, and perhaps also people who had been invited. And so one of the big concerns that I would have is who will it be shown to? How will it be received and interpreted? Will it become will it leave the control of the people who are sharing that? Will it go onto social media? Will it go into the newspapers as part of a theater review, etc.? That's a big issue. The other is, of course, we need to avoid re-traumatizing the people who have gone through that experience. And I have seen instances where I have seen audiences in the theater being so appalled and so overwhelmed by unprocessed material that they themselves have been left very vulnerable. So who are you inviting to see this material? Just one quick example, a group of people with histories of substance misuse doing a play about their lives and their addiction, but the invited audience were people who were also going through recovery, many of them being left in a very distressed state. So we don't want to repeat those errors. But I do want to highlight one thing, which I saw so beautifully represented in Pablo's video just now. And it's a very important feature of psychodrama and drama therapy, which is the catharsis of aesthetic transformation. It's one of 5 types of catharsis we talk about in psychodrama, where often towards the end of a therapeutic process, the pain, the suffering, whatever it is that we've experienced is transformed through aesthetic processes, perhaps into images or expressions of energy, of beauty, of hope, of communal activity, of collectiveness. We might end a psychodrama with a dance, for example, or a song, communal expressions of hope, new ways of being with other people. This is very important to include, particularly if people have experienced overwhelming danger beyond their capacity to cope, overwhelming terror, fear that they might have died. So important if you're going to offer them a dramatic process to move towards hope and healing. And that can be done so beautifully in the theater because it's such a collective process. And that can be shared only with the group or with invited audiences. I have also seen it done with public audiences. And so all of those thoughts come to mind in response to your question there, Amy.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, what I'll do is I'll just, based on some reflections on what we've just seen, I'll try to situate what I do and also speak to the questions that my colleagues have answered for themselves. I felt it was necessary to train in therapy before I felt I could apply theater to therapy. So I went and got a degree in Gestalt psychotherapy. But this was because I had noticed how transformative working in a prolonged way with physical theater practices seemed to be for myself and for the participants in the schools where I was teaching. So it was based really on an intuition that something was going on that was very, very, very helpful to people. That after 2 years at the École de Coq, where I trained, people seemed to be just better integrated, happier. The French expression is bien dans leur peau. You know, they were sort of radiant. They looked, you know, sort of very physical and healthy. And it just seemed to have a really transformative effect. So I was curious about this. And I trained in Gestalt psychotherapy, inspired by my friend and colleague Giovanni, who's in the room with us. And that was a really immense process, an 8-year process, which was not as inspiring as the work I had done with Giovanni, I have to say, in many instances. But it was worthwhile. It was really good. And I came away with a very strong imperative from Gestalt, which really changed my view. It didn't give me the tools I had acquired from the pedagogic lineage in which I studied, the Lecoq, Jacques Copeau, Suzanne Bing, this kind of family, theatrical family. These were my tools. But Gestalt gave me a perspective on these tools. And it's something that you have both addressed, both Clark and Pablo, about what it is to create something that expresses an experience. And Paul Goodman writes, "The creation of a strong Gestalt is itself the cure." This is a tremendously empowering statement to artists who are wondering why their practice seems to be good for people, but yet the budget is always being cut and people are always squeezing the arts, and it seems to be great for the community, and yet it's so hard to rationalize, you know, why that's more important than pumping more money into whatever other venue. The creation of a strong Gestalt is itself the cure. So when we express something very completely, we form a strong Gestalt around it, and that is I mean, I think you speak to this, Clark, when you talk about the drama spiral. If people are if it's too fresh, they can't make a strong gestalt around it. And what you clearly do, Pablo, is you clearly bring people to the point where they can create strong metaphor, satisfying metaphor. They feel there's a kind of wholeness in what they've done. And that is what Gestalt identifies, or at least Paul Goodman identifies as the curative process. So that was my real inspiration in taking the tools from the physical theater training that I had and applying it to psychotherapy. And I think there are just some things which I would signal as being kind of discoveries. I think we know that embodiment and identification with parts of our psyche or with roles in a myth, for example, I think this is quite common already in drama therapy and perhaps psychodrama. I would be curious to hear more about that distinction, Clark. This is already common practice to embody a character, to embody yourself in a scenario, to embody a character in a myth. This is already something that is done a lot in the drama therapeutic world, to my knowledge, because I've done some training in it. What is not given, I think, a whole lot of value is improvisation itself. Improvisation, as I feel it and as I experience it, is a state of flow. And improvisation takes you into a relationship with the imaginal. And this is a perspective on Jungian psychodrama, which is more perhaps according to Hillman than it is to Jung. But that the imaginal space is a privileged space. And that when we're improvising, we go into a very direct relationship to our unconscious, which is akin to dreaming. And it's what Jung did with active imagination as well. And there's something about going into this spontaneous flow-based process, which we do very naturally when we improvise, which is an absolute goldmine to psychotherapeutic process, because you're essentially, it's a kind of lucid dreaming. And so what I do with clients is I go into a flow-based improvisational process where they're basically dreaming something, and then we sort of look at it as one would dream work. And what is another opportunity with this flow-based improvisational embodiment is that it can work recursively. So in other words, you identify an issue and then you frame another experiment, that's the Gestalt word for it. You frame another experiment that permits you to go even deeper into that issue. So it's like a deep dive into your dream. So if you had the ability to manipulate your dream, some people can do this. You're dreaming, you say, wow, I'm really curious about that. Let me manipulate my dream. So I go back into that childhood room and I look under the bed. So this is what you can do if you're involved in a flow-based embodied imagination process. And that's what I do with clients. There's an added component, which is that what I do is site specific, but it currently escapes me theoretically. I don't really know what to make of it. The closest I come is looking at the work of Gaston Bachelard, who writes about the poetics of space as being something that's felt and remembered with the body. So that's as close as I can come to articulating why site-specific improvisational drama therapy seems to be especially potent in my experience so far. So that's a little bit about my work. So this brings us, look at us, we're so efficient, Pablo and Clark. We've come to the 45 minutes without going over. Wonderful. So I think unless we have time for some concluding remarks. Would you like to say anything concluding on the record before we go into our informal discussion and we go off the record?
One thought that comes to mind is the idea of how people find healing. I think that because psychotherapy, psychology, clinical psychology, psychiatry, they're such prominent fields, there's a kind of an automatic assumption that if people have been traumatized, they need to go through some sort of formal therapy with a highly trained individual. However, people have been healing from trauma for many thousands of years. And I would just want to offer the view that when people have suffered horribly, how they recover is by making use of the cultural resources that are around them. And many people find healing perhaps in a song, in writing poetry, in speaking with friends, in just getting involved in normal day-to-day life, and maybe through the passage of time and gradually perhaps sharing stories with other people, joining support groups, reading literature, whatever it is that's culturally available to them, they can find healing. And what we're talking about today is what theater can also offer to that, and therapy that's inspired by theater processes. So I guess I'm just speaking there on behalf of the notion that the field of helping people heal from trauma doesn't have to be exclusively within the confines of what is called a psychotherapeutic space. That's just one thought I'd like to add here.
Thanks, wonderful. Pablo, would you like to say something in conclusion?
Yeah, I recovered some of the things you've been saying, Clark, and I think that a big topic of what you said is actually that, to recognize the difference between the wound and the scar. When we have the wound, there's nothing we can do with that but to share that experience. In order to work, we need to pass to this other part of the process, that is the scar. And I think that has to do with what you call the celebration, this fifth ring of the spiral. And for me, even if it sounds difficult, the possibility of celebrating what happened in order to use that as a clue, as a creative model, as a creative imaginary space to gaze the horizon, to gaze the future, and to go beyond our personal conception of what happened, but to create the space of protection for the next generations to come. What I think is important is, by creating this celebration, by creating this metaphor, transforming this nightmare into a dream somehow, we also prevent the next generations to be poisoned by what remains of this tragic mood, or this tragic poison that is dripping down always in our stories.
Thank you. Okay, so Falguni, I'm going to ask you to stop the recording at this